Hello everyone, back again with movie and tune recap. Today, I'm going to explain a Canadian psychological thriller horror film from 2026, titled The Boy with My Son's Face. Spoilers ahead, so watch out and take care. The movie begins with a couple, Susan and Mark, waking up to the sound of their newborn son, Dylan, crying through the baby monitor. Susan goes to his crib to comfort him, but while doing so, she hears a loud crash coming from downstairs. She gently places Dylan back in his crib and goes to investigate, only to find the front door standing wide open. After closing it, she suddenly hears Dylan crying even louder. She rushes back upstairs, only to discover that his crib is empty. Panicked, Susan quickly informs Mark before rushing downstairs to call 911 and report that their baby is missing. While speaking with the emergency operator, she notices the silhouette of someone standing behind the curtain. She grabs a golf club for protection and slowly approaches the curtain. The scene then flashes back to an earlier time when Susan is in labor, with Mark by her side encouraging her throughout the delivery. After a difficult labor, she finally gives birth to Dylan, bringing great joy to the couple. Later, Mark tells Susan that he has informed his estranged father about the birth of their son, a decision Susan is not happy about. A few minutes later, Mark's estranged father, Neil, arrives at the hospital with his much younger wife, Ginny, carrying gifts for the newborn. While Neil is excited to meet his grandson, Ginny chats with Susan and mentions that she might be pregnant as well. Neil does not stay long, explaining that he has business to attend to, and he and Ginny soon leave the hospital. After being discharged, Susan and Mark return home, where they are welcomed by Aunt Peggy, a journalist. Peggy has come to help care for Dylan since Susan's mother has passed away, and Susan is still adjusting to being a first-time mother. Later, Susan struggles to calm Dylan as he cries non-stop until Mark takes him into his arms. He quickly manages to soothe the baby and explains that he used the same method on his younger brother whenever he cried as a child. The couple then talks about their new life as parents, admitting that they are still trying to adjust while sharing a few light-hearted jokes about the experience. As a first-time mother, Susan is overwhelmed and constantly stressed, and one day, while rushing to attend to Dylan's cries, she slips on one of his toys and injures her ankle. Later, her friend Alice comes over to help, and having recently given birth herself, Alice understands that Susan is likely exhausted and believes her mom brain may be kicking in. Soon, Mark returns home from work, and Alice leaves, and after seeing Susan's condition, Mark suggests hiring a nanny to help care for Dylan. However, Susan refuses, insisting that she does not want anyone else raising her son and that she is capable of doing it herself, and her response leaves Mark frustrated. Later, while taking a walk with their babies, Alice suggests that Susan may be suffering from postpartum depression, a condition that is common among new mothers. Susan dismisses the idea, insisting that she is fine. However, she suddenly becomes dizzy and nearly walks into the path of a passing car with Dylan. The scene then returns to the opening events of the movie. While on the phone with 911 after discovering Dylan missing from his crib, Susan notices the silhouette of someone behind a curtain and attacks it, only to realize that nobody is actually there. Just then, Mark returns carrying Dylan in his arms, explaining that he found him in his crib. Susan is left confused because she is certain the crib was empty when she checked earlier. The following day, as Susan's postpartum depression worsens, Mark invites a psychologist, Dr. Riley, to speak with her. Dr. Riley explains that she understands what Susan is going through because she experienced the same struggle after becoming a mother. She tells Susan that she overcame it with medication and by hiring a nanny. Determined to get better, Susan says she is willing to do whatever it takes to overcome her postpartum depression, and Dr. Riley then prescribes her the antidepressant nortriptyline. Susan eventually agrees to hire a nanny, and Mark finds a kind and caring young woman named Amy to help the family. With Amy looking after Dylan, Susan becomes increasingly dependent on her medication, taking the pills so frequently that they are scattered all over the sink. Her addiction grows so severe that she is no longer able to function properly as either a wife or a mother. One day, Amy accompanies Susan to the hospital, and while they are there, Amy notices Susan taking her medication and gently asks if it is safe. Susan takes offense at the question and lashes out at her. However, she later calms down and apologizes. Just then, Susan suddenly begins bleeding. She experiences dizziness before collapsing to the floor. After receiving treatment and preparing to leave the hospital, Susan begs Amy not to tell Mark about what happened. Despite her promise, Amy later informs Mark. After they return home, Mark confronts Susan, and the conversation turns into an argument. Susan accuses him of spending all his time at work and leaving her to handle everything on her own, which only angers Mark further. Susan later confronts Amy, who explains that she was only trying to help, and Susan tells her to stop interfering in her family and fires her. Later, while Susan is relaxing in the bathtub, Mark approaches her and asks where Amy is. Susan tells him that Amy cannot be trusted and reveals that she has fired her. Although Mark is upset by the decision, he eventually calms down, and Susan insists that they do not need anyone else to care for Dylan. To Susan's relief, Mark tells her that he will speak to his father about working from home so he can help care for both Susan and Dylan until she recovers. However, Susan's postpartum depression continues to worsen, leaving her unable to manage even simple tasks around the house. As a result, Mark becomes the one caring for both his wife and their son. One night, while Susan is holding Dylan, she begins to suffer from hallucinations, and in the middle of the episode, she somehow ends up in the swimming pool. Mark rushes outside, and the police are soon called after Dylan is reported missing. The only thing recovered is the baby's blanket. Mark desperately asks Susan where Dylan is, but she cannot remember what happened, and when she realizes that Dylan is missing, she breaks down in tears. Following the incident, Susan is charged with manslaughter, even though Dylan's remains have never been found, and her trial is scheduled for the following week. At home, Susan watches a news report featuring testimony from people close to her. Dr. Riley suggests that Susan may have abused her medication, causing her condition to spiral out of control. Alice testifies that Susan had been pretending everything was fine despite suffering from postpartum depression. Finally, Ginny gives her own testimony, saying several hurtful things about Susan, making it clear that she harbors resentment toward her. Mark later comes to comfort Susan after her family and friends have turned their backs on her. He assures her that not everyone has abandoned her, but their conversation soon turns into an argument. In the heat of the moment, Mark calls Susan a bad mother, prompting her to slap him. Later, Susan speaks with Aunt Peggy, who is considering arranging an exclusive interview for Susan to tell the public what happened that night. However, Susan says she cannot do it. The week of Susan's trial finally arrives, and after hearing the case, the jury finds her guilty of criminally negligent homicide, and she is sentenced to 8 years in prison. While serving her sentence, Susan speaks with Mark over the phone. Although he continues trying to support her, Susan tells him to move on with his life. 4 years later, Susan is released on probation for good behavior and moves into a women's apartment, and unbeknownst to her, someone is watching her from inside a parked car. Later, Susan meets with her probation officer, who advises her to live a better life and leave her past behind, avoiding anything that could draw her back into trouble. Susan eventually finds a job at a dive bar, and on her first day, a rude customer deliberately underpays her for the drinks. When another waitress discovers what happened, she causes a scene as the customer is thrown out of the bar and his wallet is taken. After work, Susan catches up with the waitress, Cassie, and during their conversation, Cassie reveals that she is also an ex-convict and a skilled hacker. It is also revealed that the two live in the same apartment building, unaware that the mysterious person is watching them. Back in her apartment, Susan is startled by a knock at the door, and before she can respond, the mysterious person slides an envelope underneath it. Inside is a photograph of Dylan, now all grown up. Shocked by the discovery, Susan rushes outside to chase the stranger, but they have already driven away. Susan immediately takes the photo to Cassie and finally tells her about her past and what happened to Dylan, and together, they begin to wonder if Dylan might still be alive. The following day, Susan visits Aunt Peggy, who tells her that Mark has opened a women's health clinic downtown. Susan shows her the photograph of the grown-up Dylan, leaving Aunt Peggy stunned, and Susan asks for her help in finding out whether the photo is genuine. However, Aunt Peggy says she cannot help and questions who would play such a cruel joke on Susan, knowing she has just been released from prison and is still grieving. Susan then visits the women's health clinic, where she has an awkward encounter with Ginny. Ginny tells her that she has no business being there, even if the building was built and owned by her ex-husband. Later, while in a park, Susan receives a call from Cassie, who tells her that she has been fired after their employer discovered her criminal past, which has now become public knowledge. During the call, Susan spots a grown-up Dylan playing nearby, who calls out to her, but she believes she is only hallucinating. When Susan returns to her apartment, she discovers that her landlord has evicted her after learning about her past. She also becomes the target of abuse from people who now know her history. With nowhere else to go, Cassie welcomes Susan into her apartment, and as they spend more time together, Cassie teaches Susan how to fight, and the two gradually form a close friendship. Afterward, Susan and Cassie begin following Ginny, as Susan suspects she has been stalking her and is responsible for sending Dylan's photograph as part of a cruel joke. However, Cassie is not convinced that Ginny is the one behind it. Back at the apartment, Susan asks Cassie to investigate Dr. Riley. Cassie discovers that Dr. Riley died in a freak accident and that her car matches the description of the vehicle that has been following Susan. The next day, Susan and Cassie visit Mark's house, who is surprised to see Susan after so many years and reveals that he already knows Dr. Riley is dead. When Cassie shows him the photograph of the grown-up Dylan, Mark is horrified. He calls Susan sick and orders her to stay out of his life. Later, while at her new job, Susan runs into her old friend Alice, who is now with her grown-up son. Alice apologizes for publicly speaking against Susan in the past and reveals that she also suffered from postpartum depression but never told anyone because she was ashamed. She mentions that she was prescribed nortriptyline and says that sometimes the red pills do not work, but she leaves before explaining further. Shocked by this revelation, Susan rushes to the women's health clinic and asks a nurse whether nortriptyline comes in red rather than blue pills. The nurse confirms that it does, and Susan then encounters Mark and realizes that he had been switching her medication. She confronts him but is thrown out after acting irrationally. When Susan returns to Cassie's apartment, she finds it completely trashed, including Cassie's laptop, which Cassie believes Mark is responsible. Susan then tells Cassie about her discovery, concluding that the person who had been stalking her and sending the photograph of the grown-up Dylan was Dr. Riley. Despite what happened to her apartment, Cassie remains determined to help Susan uncover the truth. With her laptop destroyed, she takes Susan to the dive bar where she works and uses her work laptop to continue their investigation. Since Cassie is a skilled hacker, Susan gives her Mark's full name to investigate. During her research, Cassie discovers that Mark had been married before he met Susan, and his former wife turns out to be Amy, the babysitter. Cassie provides Susan with Amy's address, and Susan goes to her shop to confront her.
Susan!
A brief fight breaks out between them before Susan pressures Amy into telling the truth. Amy finally admits that she and Mark were in a relationship, which resulted in her becoming pregnant. However, she says that life had other plans and that having an abortion was the last thing she wanted, but she felt she had no choice. Amy insists that she genuinely wants to help Susan but claims she has no idea what happened to Dylan, and she apologizes for failing her. Back at the bar, Cassie and her friends uncover an even more shocking piece of information, although its details are not revealed. After the confrontation, Susan and Amy apologize to each other, and Susan leaves the shop. As she walks away, she notices Dylan's blanket inside Amy's car, making her realize that Amy has been lying. Susan confronts Amy again, but Amy has already called the police. The officers arrive and arrest Susan for assault. Susan is taken to her probation officer, who determines that, because of her behavior, she should be sent back to prison. While in prison, Susan receives a visit from Mark, and during their conversation, she tells him everything she has learned about him and Amy, but Mark insists that he has no idea what she is talking about. As Susan continues revealing what she knows, Mark becomes increasingly uncomfortable and prepares to leave. Before walking away, he warns Susan that he will harm Cassie, then calls the guards after Susan. Later, Susan is being transported by a prison guard from her current prison back to her old cell. Along the way, their vehicle is stopped by an angry mob blocking the road. When the crowd refuses to move, the guard steps outside to deal with the situation. Realizing the mob consists of Cassie's friends who have come to rescue her, Susan takes control of the steering wheel and drives away. She heads to Cassie's apartment, only to find it in complete disarray, and nearby, Cassie lies badly injured after being attacked by Mark. Struggling to breathe, Cassie hands Susan the results of their latest research. Minutes later, Cassie dies, although the information she uncovered is not immediately revealed. That night, as Mark prepares to leave town, he hears strange noises coming from downstairs and goes to investigate. He is confronted by Susan, who attacks him and repeatedly demands that he tell her the truth. According to Cassie's research, Amy's real name is Jackie and that she is actually Mark's sister. Mark finally confesses that their father forced them into an abusive relationship, which resulted in Amy becoming pregnant. The complications from her abortion left her unable to have another child. After Dylan was born, Amy threatened to expose Mark unless he gave the baby to her, and on the night Dylan disappeared, Amy was present at the house. Mark also admits that Susan never suffered from postpartum depression. Instead, he had been secretly drugging her, and Dr. Riley was part of the conspiracy. Their original plan was to prove that Susan was an unfit mother so that Child Protective Services would take Dylan away. However, after Susan sent Amy away, their plan fell apart, forcing them to escalate the situation. A violent struggle breaks out between the two, and Mark eventually gains the upper hand and begins strangling Susan. Just in time, Amy arrives and stops him, but Mark drags her away as Susan loses consciousness. When Susan regains consciousness, she finds a bloody knife in her hand and Amy's lifeless body lying nearby. With the police on their way, she realizes that Mark has killed Amy and is attempting to frame her for the murder. Susan quickly escapes and runs to her estranged father, Neil, for help. She explains everything that has happened, and despite Ginny's objections, Neil decides to help his daughter. Neil tells Susan that Mark has filed a flight manifest for one of their planes, which is scheduled to depart at midnight. He gives Susan the keys to one of his cars, and she drives to the airfield, and on the way, she calls the police and also contacts Aunt Peggy, informing them of her location. Susan confronts Mark as he prepares to leave, but the police arrive and detain her instead. She insists that Mark is trying to flee with her son and begs the officers to search the plane. After finding no one on board, the police begin to believe that Susan is unstable. Just then, Aunt Peggy arrives, and remembering something Mark had told her earlier, she asks the officers to check Mark's car tire well. At the same time, Susan attacks Mark, and to everyone's surprise, Dylan is found hiding in the tire well. Susan is finally reunited with her son, who recognizes her as his mother, and Mark is arrested. Later, Aunt Peggy apologizes to Susan for not believing her from the beginning, but Susan tells her it is okay before appearing on a podcast to share everything that happened. 3 months later, Susan celebrates the grand reopening of the Women's Health Clinic. Neil, Ginny, who is now pregnant, Aunt Peggy, and many others attend the event. During the ceremony, Susan dedicates the clinic to Cassie and honors her for standing by her during her darkest moments, helping her uncover the truth, and teaching her to fight for justice. Okay guys, that's all the recap about The Boy with My Son's Face from 2026. Thanks for watching, see you again in the next video.